So yeah, we're just gonna hang out for a little bit before we go get drinks. And we're gonna sort of decompress, and we're gonna talk about the day. And first, Tim, I didn't set you up for this, but I'm very curious why you chose to wear your Writers Guild of America shirt today. It was clearly
I mean, an AI reference. It was a material part of the strike, was the use of Writers Guild content in training AI. So I thought it was apropos.
good work.
Yeah, thanks.
So I opened the day by talking about the thing I was most wrong about coming out of last year. We all sat up here last year talking about this. We don't have all the answers, but looking back 12 months ago, what were you most wrong about, Mark?
Me? Well, it's nice to be here again. One of the common conversations, I think quite a few of us were here last year, is having this moment in time to come back together to reflect on that question. Before I get into that, is Jenny Nicholson still here? Yeah, I'm really intimidated by your productivity. I haven't quite digested that year of work, because I think you may have done more than most companies with 1,000+ people did in AI in a year. So it was incredible. So good for you. Look, I think the thing that surprised me, and we've talked about this, and you've opened with it, is the percentage of energy people have put in and organizations have put in to building a box to keep AI in. We were given a rocket and we're flying it to Indiana. And it's really strange that we as a group of creative, curious people would take something with such a vast potential and worry so much about finding something that gives us the illusion of security by focusing so much on how this won't take our job, it won't take a job. Is it not going to take a job? It may take the job you're doing, but it won't take the job you're going to do if you focus on that. Yeah. And that's been the biggest surprise. I was at the BrXnd group last year. We got a wonderful company, Pencil, built Pencil Pro, took it to Cannes. I was like in Cannes, pitching that, doing my tap dance. I was like, this thing is going to, not just that, the whole area is going to explode. It feels much more under the water than I would have thought it would have been. I've been kind of astounded. I lost money.
I think the thing that surprised me in the last year, was really the change in how we evaluate models, or that is to say, how we determine whether or not a model is good or not. Which is, it's been a research field for some time. And so like academics, they come up with all sorts of benchmarks, right? Like, well, you are 10% better than this model, And I think one of the strange things that's happened the last year is that these metrics that we use for determining whether or not Model A is better than Model B have been so thoroughly gamed that they are effectively meaningless. And so nowadays, actually, it's very funny to me that the standard way you evaluate whether or not a model is good is you talk to it for 15 minutes, and then you're basically like, yeah, this one seems better. And it's interesting to me that that kind of mid-wit, zero brain cell way of evaluating models is in effect kind of the gold standard for how we determine this now. And it's most represented by this site called Chatbot Arena, which has become the leaderboard for determining what model is good and what model isn't. And it's literally just people talking with the model for a little bit and being like, I like that one. And that's how we're doing it. And it feels like models are moving into the realm of taste more than anything else.
If you haven't seen Chatbot Arena, by the way, highly recommend checking it out. So the way it works, if you're familiar with the ELO ratings in chess, where basically if you play a similarly ranked opponent and you beat them, you only get a little bit of points. If you beat somebody much better than you, you get a lot of points, or I might be getting it slightly wrong. Maybe you can explain ELO better. But basically, the way it works is you just put a prompt in and they give you two different responses and you choose which one is better based on no criteria at all, except however you're feeling in that moment. And the rankings are sort of amazingly accurate, I would say, as to sort of where the best models are. GPT-4 was pretty dominant forever. I think maybe it's sort of back at the top. Claude, when Opus 3 came out, sort of reached. And yeah, Tim and I have been kind of obsessed with this particular point. That's my vibes versus over evals kind of got at this. It is a really interesting problem to me too, because I got excited when Claude 3 came out and I started using it, but I started using it specifically for writing because I thought it was a better writer, and I've been puzzled why it's a better writer. And my best guess for why it's a better writer is that I think it's better at giving responses that sound like my prompt. So I think it's a better writer because it sounds more like me.
They have narcissism through that.
Totally.
Well, and-
Intelligence.
Yeah. I mean, and that is a big surprise. Is like, I think had we been talking last year, the assumption would have been like one model to rule them all,
Yeah.
right? That eventually like one company will produce the biggest model that will be the most capable and everybody will come to depend on it. And to wit, that was like OpenAI. And I think kind of a year on, it's sort of like, actually, there's a small handful of really leading companies in the space, but it's like each model seems to have different things that it's good at. And this ends up being more of like a, strengths and weaknesses thing than it is like one model establishing like absolute hegemony over the market.
And I think it depends what you're doing. I mean, your wonderful presentation today, Tim, is like, it's what you do with it. And this idea, thing Noah and I talk about a lot, is this idea of, you said psychology, it's like humanity is that creativity unlocks the potential of all technology, particularly this one. And the nuance, the humanity, the psychology of how we unlock it is the defining differentiating factor. We are the killer app for unlocking this stuff. So doing a model like this is better than that, well, it depends. What do you do? It's like having two pianos and saying which piano is better. Well, technically that one, but if somebody sits down at that piano who's a much better player to get something out of it, it's going to be extraordinary. And I think that, as we talk today, about a previous point around it, what is our role in that? Our role in that is to use our humanity to unlock its potential. And Noah and I talk about this a lot. The crazy thing about this space is the seeming irrationality of the responses you get. I mean, it's your presentation. It's like, that's the craziest part of it. And that's the most interesting area, I think, for all of us to play.
Yeah, I think, one of the conversations I've definitely repeated over the last year is this thing about sort of leaning into the hallucinations, right? Like, I think there's a lot of people, Tim, you brought it up last year when you were talking about sort of how search is the first use case. And it's such a funny first use case because it's totally dependent on like
we get you the fact.
We give you the fact. Well, like we don't hallucinate. And it's just, if you're going to start somewhere, you might as well start somewhere where hallucinations are a positive, not a negative.
Yeah.
Just because it's going to be easier.
I think a lot of that's in the word too. I think words really matter early on, and it was also relatively early on. I think one of the worst pieces of branding with artificial intelligence is the word artificial. It's not artificial. What's artificial? It's creative. It's a creative intelligence, and they're not hallucinations. They're actually, as you pointed out a year ago and today, they're the product. They are that connection between the technical capacity of these tools and our mind, and you brought this word up again, and I think it's really important to underscore this: taste. We live in this era of creative abundance. We saw so many tools today that instantaneously produce content, film, words, documents, manifestos, whatever it may be. We live in an era of exponential creative abundance. Therefore, its value is zero. But the right thing is invaluable, and choosing that right thing is a question of taste. That is the big shift, I think. And as people, and it is one of the dominant themes we all look at as professionals, what's our role? That to me is the primacy of our role.
There was on taste, there's been a great series of podcasts with Ben Thompson from Stratechery. He did it with Daniel Gross and why can I not think of his name? Started GitHub, or he didn't start GitHub. Nat Friedman.
Yeah.
And they've been doing these interviews, and in maybe the last one or the one before, they talked about the role of taste in fine-tuning models. And basically what it's looking like increasingly is that part of what differentiates these models is the taste of the model makers in how they fine-tune it and the data that they choose. So, I mean, on that second point, I know you've been sort of super into this. Like, tell us about your thoughts around the perfect data set.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so one of the interesting competitive dynamics you see in the space right now is that essentially all the serious players have ingested all of the easily accessible data on the internet. And one funny irony of that is that means that everybody's sort of playing off of the same base to begin with. And so the big competition now is like, well, what's the additional data you have that's going to get the model to behave in this extra way? And so there's this race to get proprietary data, to generate your own data. But what's interesting is that, like, if you think about this historically, it's like, okay, everybody starts collecting as much data as possible. And then at some point, everybody has the same data because they've collected all the easily available data. So there's this kind of historical moment of convergence And then now kind of where we're headed is, well, everybody's seeking competitive advantage. So they're kind of trying to lock down their own special kinds of data, which is going to result in the models diverging again in terms of their behavior. And yeah, and I think this kind of goes to these really interesting questions, which is like, well, I really want to train a model that just gives me like really punchy conversation. Okay, what does that actually even mean? And like the compilation of the data set that you would need to do that fine tuning is ultimately kind of a matter of taste. And I think, you can actually feel talking to a bunch of people who are like machine learning engineers and, members of technical staff at these companies, they're very frustrated by this because it's like, well, what's the standard data set for punchy conversation? And it like just doesn't exist. There's no good benchmark for it. And so like what has started as like a deeply computer science thing is now kind of entering this realm, which is sort of just like, well, I like it because it pops, or like this AI is going to go far. It's got moxie, right? And I think like weirdly, I think we may be in that universe. It's like you're building a chatbot, you're like not competing with other pieces of software. It's like Tom Hanks, like you're basically like you're CAA, you're not necessarily like Microsoft.
I feel like, Mark, you could knock out a punchy data set in
Well,
like
that's
an
going to be
hour.
one of the things we're doing. I think but it is. It's like I think the language around this is really important and fascinating to think about because you get into, you really do get into humanity questions where, we've talked about this. It's like we look at most computer systems through time and we say, well, I need to operate this. This is gonna make me operate the system better. We have a mouse. If you're old enough to have had MS-DOS, and then we had a mouse, and it's really exciting. And I think I've been looking at AI, if you want to, that way, like this. This is going to help me, who's not a technical person, operate this better. And I think it's wrong. I think the way to look at it is it enables that system to operate me better. And that humanity is the great unlock. So the more we flip that, it's not that way, it's this way. And that meeting point, that's what unlocks the magic. And that does become, I love your AI aficionado that you asked me to invest in as an idea, because that's the kind of language structure you kind of need to appreciate the texture and variety and enormity of what we can create over the next decade or so. And that's cool. That's like really cool. It's very artistic.
Yeah, I definitely think these analogies.
It's a pain, like you open your morning with such wonderful things. And I'll do a very old thing on the back end. All the people under 40 can Google what a slide rule is. It's a paintbrush, not a slide rule. Do you know what I mean? It is an instrument. This thing is going to be an instrument to do things with, not something prescriptive. And that's as you pointed out in your opening, your brilliant opening this morning. That is a new thing for us to tackle. We've never had to tackle with a tool like this before.
Yeah, one of the things I've been experimenting with is essentially like this idea of like, could you do a recital with like a chatbot? So the notion is like, I get up on stage and you all watch me have a conversation with an AI. And the question is like, well, are certain people better at doing that than others? And the answer has to be yes, right? Like in the sense that like certain panels are better than others. And so, I really like the idea that this actually could become a kind of performance art. Like, oh, he plays ChatGPT just so beautifully. Like it's like a real virtuoso with it. Like there's no reason why we couldn't like imagine that world. And actually as a performance medium, it's actually quite fun to watch. Like someone who's really good at it, it's like very entertaining.
Yeah.
And so I do think you could actually craft it as a kind of performance art.
I think you just sold a Netflix comedy special right now on the stage.
But yeah, one more point on data though is I think it also flips a lot of our traditional notions about internet economics on its head. Because the old notion was like, how we've been talking a decade ago, it'd be like data is everywhere. It's very cheap and very accessible. And all the businesses we can do with data-driven innovation would be like the phrases that we would be using. But this is almost a world where like data is like, the good data is very scarce. And so I kind of envision in the future that there'll be kind of like data ateliers. Like you go and you're like, I really need a data set for fine tuning that looks like this. And they pre-assemble it for you. And I think it's not that crazy if you see what happened to like Reddit in the last year, right? Where they said, we have this API that other people can build businesses on top of. We're going to cut off access to that because we think we can make more money selling this great human data for AI training purposes. Kind of suggests that basically like the value of this like data that they have has become more valuable than sort of the traditional mode, which is, well, make it widely accessible and then you become a platform and, you're Tim O'Reilly circa the early 2000s. So.
On the data point, one of the questions I had an argument recently with somebody about whether Twitter's data was valuable. And my argument was basically no, that like, there's nothing sort of interesting in the tweets. Like Reddit is so perfectly structured. That's part of what makes it so good is it's this Q&A format, right? Like you have these sort of question posts and answer posts. Whereas, I think if you look at most of Twitter, it's sort of just people talking, and it seems like we probably have enough of that. Like my feeling from looking at sort of the way some of these are trained and kind of some of the materials, like, it's like we're probably fairly capped out on sort of generalized internet discourse. Like they're probably pretty good there.
Yeah, and I think you add to it the pollution problem, right, that people have been talking about is like all of this open data is now filled with AI content itself. And there's some evidence to sort of suggest that models that are trained on sort of model outputs degrade in performance, right? So there's this kind of interesting thing that like the free data becomes increasingly poisonous for AI training, which again creates like the need for these like incredibly valuable, incredibly proprietary data sets that you want to train on.
That's why Mark's investing in AI aficionados.
That's why I am.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm a founder investor. I think there's something analogous too from the data to the content as well, right? And that if you look, whether it's journalism, whatever the content is, one of the things we said last year, I think it was one of the things when I was first asked to look at AI was you can see pretty quickly that mediocrity, pick anything you like that you've seen, mediocrity is free. So anything, if you want to headlines, everything from mediocre and worse is now instantaneous and free. That is just like out of the gate, and it's improving. So it's mediocre, free, and it's improving. Therefore, if you're going to focus on something, you have to focus. All the energy is going to be above that. All the energy is going to be things, long-form journalism that you go, there is no way that was written by AI. Like on a level, and I don't mean as a test, but I mean, it's like it's so obviously deeply human and has such a point of view that those are the things that are going to stand out. And I think, again, there's a creative challenge, whether it's a brand that's going to be differentiated, whether it's as a creator that's going to be differentiated. The starting point is going to be one of real expression. Because if you're just going to be vanilla, I assure you I can make vanilla faster, cheaper than you can. I guarantee it. And that's going to be across every field of endeavor. Therefore, the tools Meta launched today is going to machine out content, which is in a lot of ways very empowering to small businesses and going to we talked about this. I actually, Noah sent me the transcript of what we talked about last year. So I put it in to make sure I looked at what we talked about. And one of the things we talked about was the amazing empowerment these tools are going to give small businesses. A lot of people here work for fancy companies, but really it's to people, the value of AI, the relative value of AI as a tool, like all tools, but particularly these tools, is in direct proportion to your own limitation, right? So like I am a copywriter by training. I'm just an over-promoted copywriter. I'm terrible with anything design-wise. Like I'm terrible at doing that. AI for me is a superpower because it makes me incredibly mediocre at doing visuals, but I was terrible at doing visuals. But as far as writing, it's somewhat useful, but it's not as useful at. And I think that's true for organizations, and that's for all of us. It's the relative value of what we are deficient in is what its power is.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting kind of meta question here about what kinds of style are defensible in a world of AI. Right, because I think a little bit about so people were finding it actually turns out that copying Wes Anderson is very easy for models to do because it's so particular and so distinctive that it's very easy to print copies of it using AI. And then on the other hand, it's if you're too generic, then you also get wiped out. And there's kind of this question of just okay, so if you want to have an aesthetic that's hard for AI to copy, what are the attributes of that brand? Seems to end up being this kind of really interesting set of questions.
Yeah. Well, and that's, again, we come back to the value. I'm incredibly self-serving this because I have a background as creative, but I really believe creative capital, true creative capital, true differentiation, originality, teaching our kids to be artists and thinkers and dreamers is actually the killer differentiation we're going to need and the people we bring into companies, into the voices we hear and that we follow is not going to be homogenized committee-based creativity where everyone gets a voice. It's going to be people with an absolute point of view because Wes Anderson's easy to copy. He's not easy to originate. It's very hard to be Wes Anderson. It's very easy to copy Wes Anderson. So encouraging these skill sets in our kids, encouraging them in schools, encouraging those people to be hired in workforces, even if they don't have 12 degrees, they come from different communities. That true diversity That's going to be the thing that'll make you unbelievably valuable as a company, particularly a company that wants to stand out for less money.
Last thoughts, guys, before we go get drinks at the bar.
Well, I opened last year, and I'll do this. The conference is amazing. You're amazing for putting it on. I think most of you know how hard this man works to pull this off with his team, so I want to give you a round of applause for that. And last year, the analogy, because you opened with analogies, was I talked about being early in the music business, being in a punk scene in '77 or whatever, Seattle, whatever you want to do. And this feels like year 2 of a scene of people who are coming together to, as you challenge us to do, to ask questions and to explore and to be open. And it's a real privilege to be here. So thank you, Noah. You're amazing.
Thank you.
I can't follow that up. That's great.
That's it?
Okay.